The morning sun cast a soft golden hue over the city of Atlanta as Amara adjusted her backpack and stepped onto the sidewalk. She could feel the slight weight of the new school pressing on her chest, the anticipation crawling up her spine. Her curls bounced freely as she walked, a halo of thick, coiled hair that her mother used to call her crown of courage. But today, that crown felt heavier than usual. Amara had always taken pride in her hair. Her mother used to sit with her for hours, detangling each section with patience and love, braiding it into intricate patterns, or letting it flow in its natural fullness. At her old school, the halls echoed with voices that sounded like hers, laughter that carried the rhythm of shared roots. She had friends who wore their afros with boldness, who switched between twists, puffs, and locks without second thought. Identity there felt effortless, like slipping into a familiar rhythm. But things were different now. As she approached the towering red brick building of her new middle school, she could already feel the change in the air. The students streaming in through the front doors didn't look like the ones from her old neighborhood. Lighter skin, straighter hair, brand names she didn't recognize stitched onto their jackets and backpacks. Her heart thudded a little harder with every step. She smoothed the sides of her hair, even though she knew it wouldn't change a thing. The first few classes passed in a blur. Names were called, rules recited, syllabi handed out. Her teacher seemed kind enough, but there was an edge of unfamiliarity in the way they paused over her name during roll call, as if afraid to say it wrong. She had to repeat it twice. "It's Amara, Amara," before they nodded politely and moved on. By lunch, the unease had settled into a quiet storm inside her. In the cafeteria, she scanned the room for a familiar face, any friendly glance, any open seat that didn't already have a tight circle of friends wrapped around it. She ended up in the corner, tray untouched, listening to the clatter of trays and bursts of laughter that weren't hers to share. It was there, during that first quiet lunch, that she felt it. The first whisper. A group of students passed by, not close enough to make eye contact, but close enough for her to hear the muffled giggle and the murmur. "That's a lot of hair for one head." She pretended not to notice, eyes fixed on her juice carton, hands trembling just slightly beneath the table. She had heard things before, jokes on TV, comments from strangers, but never here, never in a place that was supposed to be hers too. The next few days were a slow climb up a slippery slope. She told herself she was imagining it. Maybe they weren't looking at her hair. Maybe they weren't whispering about her. Maybe she was being too sensitive. But the pattern became harder to ignore. She'd walk down the hallway and feel the quiet pause in conversation, the way some girls exchanged glances, the way a boy coughed loudly and muttered something under his breath just as she passed. The worst part wasn't even the words. It was the silence, the lack of acknowledgement, the isolation, the way teachers never seemed to notice the shift in tone when she entered the room. She became hyper-aware of how much space her hair took up. She started sitting at the edge of group tables, avoiding leaning back, so it wouldn't brush against anyone. She avoided the mirror in the girls' bathroom. She avoided her own reflection in the windows. Then came Thursday. It started like any other day. The sky over Atlanta was a soft gray, threatening rain. Amara wore her favorite sweatshirt, and her hair picked out in a soft, rounded shape that framed her face. She tried to hold her shoulders square as she walked through the halls, but a heaviness had become part of her now. In third period, she sat at the back of the science lab, quietly scribbling notes while the teacher talked about ecosystems. The classroom was filled with low murmurs, the sound of pages turning, the scratch of pens. And then it happened. A boy named Jacob, tall and smug with the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned, turned in his seat. His voice cut through the classroom like a drop plate. "Hey," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is that a wig, or did a dust cloud explode on her head?" There was a split second of silence, a breath held, and then laughter erupted, high-pitched, sharp, cruel. Even the ones who didn't laugh wore that look of amused disbelief, the kind that stung worse than outright mockery. Amara didn't move. Her pen froze in place. Her face burned. She could hear the teacher saying something, a nervous scolding, something about respect and inappropriate comments, but it was weak, an afterthought, like an apology without meaning. She wanted to disappear, to fold herself into the desk, to shrink so small no one would ever see her again. Instead, she did what she had learned to do over the last few days. She stayed still. She acted like she didn't hear. She focused on a line of ink that curved across her page, even as her eyes blurred with tears she refused to let fall. When the bell rang, she rushed out of the classroom before anyone could speak to her. She didn't stop by her locker. She didn't respond to the two girls who giggled behind her. She ran all the way home, her breath shallow, her cheeks flushed with a heat that didn't come from the run. At home, the door creaked open, and she slipped inside quietly. Her grandmother, Ruth, was in the kitchen, humming to herself, the scent of sweet cornbread filling the air. Amara didn't stop. She mumbled something about homework and vanished into her room, locking the door behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands clenched in her lap, and that was when she heard the soft knock. Ruth's voice was gentle, but clear. "Amara, baby, talk to me." Amara stayed silent, but Ruth didn't walk away, and what she did next would change everything. The knock at her bedroom door returned, this time more insistent, but still gentle. Ruth didn't speak again. She waited. Amara stayed where she was, frozen on the edge of the bed. She had pulled her knees up to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them, chin pressed down as if the position might contain the storm building inside her. Her eyes burned, but the tears never came. Not yet. Instead, there was only silence and the faint echo of laughter that refused to leave her memory. She didn't need to hear it again to know how it felt. That sound, raw and ugly, was carved into her. After a few more seconds, she heard Ruth's footsteps retreat down the hallway, but something told her it wasn't over. Her grandmother never pushed. She knew how to wait, how to read silence like others read books. She had grown up in a time when silence was often safer than words. But Ruth also knew when silence became a cage. 15 minutes passed before Amara heard the front door open and close. Curious, she peeked out of her room to find the house empty. Her grandmother's shoes were gone, her purse missing from its usual spot by the coat rack. For a moment, Amara wondered if Ruth had gone to the store, or maybe to church for one of her spontaneous check-ins. She wasn't expecting what would happen next. The next morning, Amara walked into school feeling more hollow than angry. She had not spoken a single word to Ruth the night before. They had eaten in separate rooms, a quiet that neither television nor music could fill. Amara had gone to bed early, waking with the same tightness in her chest that had followed her all week. She was beginning to forget what lightness felt like. As she entered the school building, she kept her head low, trying to slip through the halls like smoke. In her mind, the laughter was still happening, looping behind every whisper and glance. She had stopped wearing her hair out. That morning, she had stuffed it into a bun so tight it hurt, strands protesting at the nape of her neck. But pain, she figured, was easier to manage when it was physical. It was during second period, in the middle of an equation on the whiteboard, that the door opened and her world shifted. "Excuse me," said the front desk secretary, standing at the threshold. "Miss Robinson? There's someone here to see you." The teacher blinked, marker hovering midair. "Is it a parent? Is everything all right?" She said it's a quick drop-off, a document or something. The teacher nodded. "All right, Amara, you can step out." Amara's stomach dropped. She hadn't forgotten anything. She knew it wasn't her mother. Her mom had left for a work trip 2 days ago. That only left one person. She walked slowly into the hallway and immediately saw her. Ruth stood with her back straight, her presence filling the corridor with a kind of quiet authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. She wore a long navy coat, the hem brushing the tops of her boots. Her silver-streaked hair was shaped into a majestic afro, proudly defiant, not one curl apologizing for its space. She held a single manila folder in her hands, but it was clear that wasn't the reason she had come. "Hey, baby," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I was just dropping something off." Amara opened her mouth to respond, but Ruth's eyes drifted over her shoulder. "I'd like a word with your class," she added, almost as an afterthought, but her tone left no room for debate. Amara froze. "Grandma, what?" But Ruth was already walking past her, her boots clicking softly on the polished floor, her stride steady. She didn't look back. Amara had no choice but to follow. Inside the classroom, heads turned. The teacher looked up, startled, but didn't protest. Something about Ruth's presence made people listen before they questioned. She stopped at the front of the room, placed a folder down on the teacher's desk, and turned to face the class. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and unshaken. "I know you're in the middle of a lesson, and I promise I won't take long. My name is Ruth Freeman, and I'm Amara's grandmother." The room was quiet, not like before when laughter filled the space. This was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm or a revelation. "I came here because I saw something in my granddaughter yesterday," she said. "Something I hadn't seen in a long time, a kind of shrinking. And I thought to myself, no, not today." Amara stood frozen near the doorway, her eyes locked on the floor. She didn't dare move. "When I was your age," Ruth continued, "I wore my hair like this, bold, proud, and free. And just like now, some people thought it was strange. Too big, too wild, too black. But to me, it was never just hair. It was history. It was defiance. It was identity." There was a shift in the room. A few students looked up from their desks. Some fidgeted. Others simply listened. "I grew up in the South during the 60s, she said, her voice never wavering. "When wearing your hair like this could cost you a job, or get you followed around in a store, or worse. But I wore it anyway, because our hair tells the story of our people, of where we've been and where we are going." She moved toward the chalkboard, picked up a piece of white chalk, and in large, even strokes wrote, "Identity is power." Then she turned back to face them. "I am not here to lecture," she said. "I'm here to remind. What you say about someone's hair might seem small, like a joke, like nothing, but it matters. Words matter. And more than anything, how you choose to treat someone because of who they are, that matters most." The classroom was utterly silent now. Even Jacob, who had laughed the loudest, sat staring down at his desk, his fingers curled around his pencil like it might keep him from sliding off the earth. "I will not tell you to apologize," Ruth added, "because that only means something when it comes from the heart. But I will ask you to think, to ask yourself why someone else's confidence threatens you, why someone else's pride makes you uncomfortable. And I will ask you, what are you afraid of?" She let the question hang in the air like smoke. Amara finally raised her eyes. She looked at her grandmother standing there, tall and unyielding, and felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt all week. It wasn't relief. Not yet, but it was the beginning of something stronger than fear. Ruth placed the chalk down gently, looked once around the room, and nodded. "Thank you for your time," she said. Then she turned and walked out, her coat sweeping behind her like a flag. Amara, without thinking, followed. They walked side by side down the hallway in silence, but it wasn't the heavy kind anymore. Ruth didn't speak until they reached the front door. "I'll see you at home, baby," she said softly. Amara nodded, her throat too tight to respond. As Ruth stepped outside, Amara turned back toward the hallway. She was not ready yet, but something had shifted. The hours following Ruth's unexpected visit unfolded with a stillness that felt different from the silence Amara had grown used to. It wasn't hollow, nor was it heavy. Instead, it settled around her like a thin, invisible veil, soft, present, and unignorable. As she moved through her remaining classes, she noticed a subtle shift in energy. Whispers that once danced behind her back now paused mid-sentence when she walked by. Eyes that had avoided hers or mocked her with silent smirks now lingered, uncertain and cautious, as though seeing her through new glass. By the time the final bell rang, Amara stood at her locker in a sort of daze, her fingers clumsy on the dial. She had not spoken to anyone since her grandmother's departure, but her thoughts were loud, tangled in loops of reflection. Ruth hadn't told her she was coming. She hadn't asked permission. But in doing what she did, she hadn't spoken for Amara. She had spoken with her, as if giving voice to everything Amara had buried beneath her silence. And yet, Amara wasn't entirely sure how to feel. Grateful, yes, but also exposed. Her pain had been pulled into the open, its existence confirmed in front of her classmates. As she turned down the corridor to leave, a group of students passed her, Jacob among them. He didn't speak. His face was unreadable. A girl walking beside him, one Amara vaguely recognized from science class, gave a quick glance in her direction. There was no smirk this time, only hesitation. A fleeting expression, gone before Amara could decide what to make of it. Outside, the sky had softened into a dusky lavender, the air thick with the scent of late summer heat. She walked home slowly, her steps deliberate, as if each one might bring her closer to understanding the weight of what had happened that morning. When she reached the front porch, Ruth was there, sitting in her usual chair with a glass of iced tea in hand and a small radio murmuring old soul music at her feet. Amara didn't say anything at first. She dropped her bag inside the door and came back out, settling into the chair beside her grandmother. For a while, they said nothing. The music played softly between them, and the air moved lazily across the porch. "I didn't ask you to come," Amara said eventually, her voice quiet, not accusatory. Ruth nodded slowly, taking a sip from her glass. "No, you didn't. I didn't know you were going to say all of that." "I know." Amara turned her gaze to the street, watching a car crawl by. They were all staring. "I don't know what they're thinking now." "I can't tell you what they're thinking," Ruth said, "but I can tell you what I was thinking. I saw my granddaughter come home, carrying something that didn't belong to her. Shame. That's not something you picked up on your own. Someone gave it to you, and I wasn't about to let you keep it." Amara looked down at her lap, at the way her fingers twisted nervously. "It's not just about them laughing. It's the way they look at me, like I'm something strange." "I know that look," Ruth said softly. "I've known it for longer than you've been alive. And I also know it doesn't define you. But if you let it, it will." Amara let the words sink in. There was a certain authority in Ruth's voice that made them feel more than comforting. They felt true. That night, after dinner, Amara stood in front of the mirror in her room. She had loosened her bun, and the coils of her hair sprang free in thick spirals that framed her face. She reached for her comb, paused, and then set it down. Instead, she used her fingers, gently fluffing the roots, letting each curl find its shape. She stared at herself for a long time, not seeking perfection or hiding imperfection, but simply trying to recognize the girl looking back. The next morning, she wore her hair out again, just as she used to, not because she wanted to make a statement, but because it was hers. She stepped onto the school bus, uncertain of what would happen next, but steadier in her shoes than she had felt in days. The hallway was quieter than usual, or perhaps it only seemed that way because Amara was listening differently now. She walked to her locker, ignoring the scattered stares. In her first period class, she kept her head high, her eyes focused on the front, her notebook open and ready. Nothing extraordinary happened, but nothing cruel did either. It wasn't until lunch that something truly shifted. She was halfway through her sandwich, sitting at her usual corner table, when a girl approached. Her name was Mia. Amara remembered seeing her a few times in class, usually quiet, always with a sketchbook in hand. Mia hesitated for a moment, then cleared her throat. "Hey," she said, "is it okay if I sit here?" Amara blinked. "Yeah, sure." Mia slid into the seat across from her, setting down her tray and glancing up with an unsure smile. "Your grandma's speech was kind of amazing." Amara didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. "I never really thought about hair like that," Mia continued. "I mean, I always thought yours looked cool, but I didn't know it meant something." "It does," Amara said, her voice steady. "It means a lot." Mia opened her sketchbook and flipped to a page. "I draw sometimes. Like people. I was wondering, would it be okay if I tried drawing you? With your hair out like it is today?" Amara stared at her for a moment, trying to read her expression. There was no mockery, no pity, just genuine curiosity. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Amara allowed herself a small smile. "Yeah," she said, "that'd be cool." As the day went on, more small moments followed. A boy in her math class asked her what product she used. Another girl complimented her earrings and asked if she had any recommendations for documentaries on Black history. Even her science teacher, the one who had struggled to maintain control during Jacob's outburst, took a moment after class to apologize for not handling the situation better. "I'm learning, too," she admitted, "and I want to do better. It wasn't a miracle. Not everyone changed." Jacob still kept his distance. Some students remained quiet, but the fog had lifted. The shift was slow, but it was real. And through it all, Amara carried something new. Not a sense of being accepted, necessarily, but something far more powerful, a sense of being seen. In the days that followed, the school moved at its usual pace. Quizzes were passed out, assignments collected, announcements crackled through the intercom. But something under the surface had undeniably shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't even something most people would have noticed unless they had been watching closely. But for Amara, each day began to feel a little less like a battlefield and a little more like a space where she could breathe. She still walked the hallways with cautious eyes, but now there were pauses that felt different. Not just the absence of sneers or laughter, but the presence of a new kind of attention. Questions not laced with ridicule, glances not weighed down by judgment. Some students tried to speak to her. Others gave quiet nods of acknowledgement. These weren't grand gestures, but they were honest. More importantly, they were earned. One afternoon, after the final bell had rung and the building was thinning out, Amara was approached by Ms. Calloway, the principal, a woman of few words and always impeccably dressed. She carried herself with composed authority that most students found intimidating. "Miss Freeman," she said, her voice measured but not unfriendly. "Do you have a moment?" Amara felt a flicker of unease, but nodded. She followed the principal into her office, where sunlight streamed to the tall windows and bounced off the plaques that lined the shelves. Ms. Calloway motioned for her to sit. "I wanted to speak with you about something that came up in the staff meeting this morning," she began. "Your science teacher brought up the incident from last week, what happened in class, and your grandmother's response." Amara stiffened slightly in her chair. She hadn't expected that conversation to travel so far. "To be clear," Ms. Calloway continued, "there's no issue with what your grandmother did. In fact, several of your teachers felt it was one of the most powerful things they've seen in a classroom in a long time. And it started a conversation we should have had much sooner." Amara relaxed slightly, though her heart still raced. "We'd like to invite you and your grandmother to lead a presentation during our next Culture and Diversity Week," she said. "You wouldn't have to plan it alone. One of our social studies teachers has already volunteered to help. We want to create something meaningful, and we think your voice and hers should be at the center of it." Amara hesitated. The idea of standing in front of the entire school was overwhelming. She wasn't sure she was ready to be the face of anything, but at the same time, she felt the weight of opportunity pressing against her uncertainty. It wasn't about attention. It was about purpose. "I'll talk to her," Amara said finally. Ms. Calloway nodded. "Take your time. And thank you for your strength and for showing the rest of us what that looks like." That evening, Amara sat with Ruth on the porch again, this time under skies slowly turning amber with the setting sun. She recounted the principal's offer, watching her grandmother's face closely. Ruth didn't answer right away. She sipped her tea, set the glass down, and leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said slowly, "I didn't expect this to come from a visit with a fake excuse about a forgotten document." Amara laughed, a short burst of sound that surprised her. "You really didn't bring anything, did you?" "Of course not," Ruth replied, her grin unmistakable now. "But I brought what mattered." They sat in thoughtful silence for a while. Finally, Ruth said, "If you want to do it, I'll stand beside you, every step." "I think I do," Amara replied. "But not just because they asked, because there's more I want to say. Things I didn't know how to say before." Ruth gave a small nod. "Then we'll do it. Together." Over the next week, preparations began. Ms. Simmons, the social studies teacher, joined them with enthusiasm. She had a background in African American history and brought materials, documentaries, books, and articles that helped shape the structure of the presentation. But what truly fueled the process were the long conversations between Amara and Ruth, shared stories, lessons passed down, and reflections born of lived experience. They decided not to make a lecture. Instead, it would be a journey, part storytelling, part history, part celebration. Ruth would speak about her teenage years, the fight to wear her natural hair in the 60s, the connection between the civil rights movement and black self-expression. Amara would share her own experience, not just the bullying, but the journey through silence, fear, and reclaiming her space. There would be visuals, music, and photos. They even added a short video featuring other black students at the school who were invited to speak about their own identities and pride. When the day finally arrived, the auditorium filled quickly. The energy was different from the usual school assembly. It buzzed with curiosity, some uncertainty, but little of the dismissive apathy that often filled those seats. Teachers stood along the back walls. Students whispered quietly, and a faint hum of anticipation hung in the air. Amara stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. Ruth stood beside her, adjusting the collar of her blouse. "You ready?" she asked. Amara swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." They stepped onto stage together, and the room quieted instantly. As Ruth began to speak, her voice calm and steady, the room seemed to lean in. She spoke of her childhood in Georgia, the texture of her hair under her mother's fingers, the whispers in school, the resistance from teachers who told her she'd never get a job if she didn't straighten it. She spoke of marches, of Afros as political statements, of the power that comes from standing firm in a world that tries to shrink you. Then it was Amara's turn. She approached the microphone, hands shaking slightly, and scanned the sea of faces, some familiar, others not. She took a breath. "I didn't know what pride meant," she began, "until someone tried to take it from me." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke. She told them about her first day at school, the laughter, the way she began to shrink without realizing it. She spoke of Ruth, of the words that reached into her silence and gave her language for what she had felt. She talked about history not as something distant, but as something worn on her head, carried on her shoulders, passed down through hands and voices. When she finished, the room remained silent for a moment, not out of discomfort, but respect. Then came the applause, slow at first, then rising steadily until it filled the space. Not all clapped enthusiastically, but enough did to let her know that something real had happened in that room. As they walked off stage, Miss Calloway met them with tears in her eyes. "You didn't just speak," she said. "You gave the school a mirror." Amara didn't respond right away. She felt light, not empty, but full, like her body had finally caught up with the truth of who she was. She didn't just reclaim her voice. She expanded it. The days after presentation unfolded with a quiet, steady rhythm that brought with it not just peace, but a sense of grounded confidence Amara had never experienced before. The weight that had once clung to her shoulders, shaped by stares, whispers, and unspoken expectations, had loosened, giving way to something stronger. Her steps became more certain, her voice more audible, and her presence less an attempt to blend into the background and more a declaration of her place in the room. On Monday morning, when she walked into school, something unusual happened. At her locker, just as she was sliding her books into her bag, a girl from her homeroom, Dana, approached her with hesitant eyes and a notebook clutched against her chest. They had never spoken before beyond a quick exchange of classroom materials, but today, Dana lingered, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Hey," she said, almost too softly to be heard over the murmur of students moving through the hallway. "I watched your presentation. I didn't know how much of that was real. I guess I didn't know how much I didn't know." Amara turned, unsure how to respond. Dana wasn't hostile, just unsure, teetering between guilt and curiosity. "I'm glad you said what you said," Dana continued. "I've been thinking about it a lot. My little sister has curls like yours, and she's always asking why her hair doesn't look like mine. I never knew how to answer, but now I think maybe I do." It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was honest. Amara nodded, offering a faint but sincere smile. "That means a lot. Really." Dana hesitated, then smiled back before disappearing into flow of students. Moments like that began to surface more frequently. A teacher brought up Ruth's speech during a history lesson and invited students to reflect on how personal identity intersected with historical movements. A flyer went up in the cafeteria, inviting students to a new club focused on cultural awareness and student storytelling. Something Miss Simmons had spearheaded, inspired by the energy of the assembly. Even the science teacher, who had once been too timid to step in during the worst of the teasing, now approached Amara after class with a genuine interest in developing a more inclusive curriculum, one that made space for everyone to be seen. And yet, Amara remained wary of sudden change. She had learned enough to understand that not all shifts were lasting, and not all silences were peaceful. But what she felt now wasn't naive hope. It was earned faith in herself, in her history, and in her right to take up space without permission. Later that week, a note arrived in her locker, folded into a square, and slipped into the slats of the metal door. There was no name on it, just a short message written in green ink. You gave us all something to think about. Thank you for being brave first. She read it 3 times before tucking it into the front pocket of her backpack. That afternoon, while walking home under the weight of the August sun, Amara replayed the words again and again, not because they made her feel important, but because they reminded her that courage was contagious. At home, Ruth noticed a change too. Their dinners became longer, not because the food required more time, but because their conversations deepened. Amara asked more questions about the civil rights movement, about Ruth's teenage years, about the women in their family who had walked through similar fires and come out the other side without ashes on their skin. Ruth answered with a mixture of pride and pain, never sugarcoating the past, but never letting it diminish the dignity in their story. One evening, after clearing the dishes and drying the last plate, Ruth called Amara into the living room. She stood beside the old wooden cabinet where she kept photo albums and records, then pulled a large box from the bottom shelf. It was covered in floral fabric, worn at the edges but still intact. "I've been saving this at the right time," Ruth said, lifting the lid. Inside were dozens of items: faded photographs, yellowed letters, fabric swatches, and small trinkets. There was a hair-picked card from wood, smooth and dark with age. There was a pressed flower in a glass frame, and nestled between them was a journal, its leather cover soft from years of use. "This is your legacy," Ruth said. "Pieces of the women who came before you. They weren't perfect. They were loud, quiet, bold, frightened. But they lived with truth, and they carried their identities like armor, even when it cracked." Amara reached for the journal, flipping through pages of looping handwriting and press leaves. One entry stood out, a paragraph scrawled in quick strokes. "To be black and woman is to walk into every room already full and still be asked to explain your presence. So let them ask. Let your hair rise like a question they cannot answer." Amara ran her fingers over the words, her throat tightening. "Can I keep this?" she asked. "It's already yours," Ruth replied. That night, Amara sat at her desk, journal open beside her, pen in hand. She didn't know where to start, so she wrote what she felt. Not a story, not an essay, but a truth. "I used to think pride was something you had to wait for, like a reward. But now I think it's something you choose, even when it feels like you shouldn't, especially then." The next morning, before heading to school, Amara stood in front of the mirror with her hands poised in her hair. She took her time, shaping each section with care, letting the volume return, letting the coils speak freely. She chose a pair of earrings shaped like suns, gifts from Ruth, and slipped them on as a final touch. When she stepped outside, the sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. But Amara's shadow did not follow quietly behind her. It walked beside her, wide, bright, and unapologetically bold.